Just waiting for, okay, recording, good. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Let's see, Chris, can you go to my title slide? Perfect, thank you. All right, well, my name is Kelsey Smiley Rivera. I am one of the ESSA program managers here at DEED. Today, I will be providing you with the basics of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or the ESEA. We'll start off by covering a brief history of the ESEA, an overview of the programs found within the ESEA and the ESSA state plan. Then we'll go over some federal funding rules, the structure of DEED's ESEA staff, and we will wrap up by providing you with some helpful resources. To get us started, we have a question for the chat box. If you attended this session last year, you should get 100% on all of these questions because I didn't change them. They are the same. So if you took great notes, this should be really easy for you. The first question is, when was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, signed into law? Is it 2002, 1965, 2015, 1973, or 1892? I'll give you a second to put your answers in the chat. I see a couple 1965s. Oh, Jessica's giving hints there. All right, well, Jenny and Laurel, good job. It is 1965. It was B. All right, so the ESEA has evolved over the 57 years since it was originally signed into law. Here is an abbreviated history of the ESEA. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act into law. Part of President Johnson's war on poverty, the law represented a major new commitment by the federal government to quality and equality in educating children. The act emphasized equal access to education. It aimed to shorten the achievement gaps between students by providing federal funding to support schools with children from impoverished families. In 1968, Congress added new programs to the ESEA, including programs for migratory children and neglected and delinquent children. Congress also passed the Bilingual Education Act. In 1981, the Education Consolidation and Improvement Act was signed into law, which reauthorized the ESEA. This act significantly deregulated education in the United States and shifted a number of responsibilities back to the state level. Title I was temporarily renamed Chapter 1 under this law. In 1994, President Bill Clinton signed the Improving America's Schools Act into law. This reauthorization of the ESEA required states to develop standards and aligned tests for all students. In 2002, President George W. Bush signed the No Child Left Behind Act, NCLB, into law, which significantly expanded the ESEA's testing requirements. The law also required states to use specific interventions with schools that failed to make sufficient progress. In addition, NCLB required that all teachers be highly qualified. In 2011, with an ESEA reauthorization overdue, the Obama administration offered states waivers, easing many of the mandates of the NCLB law. And then finally, in 2015, President Obama signed into law the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. This is the most recent reauthorization of the ESEA. The Every Student Succeeds Act modified but did not eliminate provisions relating to statewide summative assessments and accountability. As we briefly discussed on the previous slide, the ESEA has been reauthorized or amended by several acts throughout the years. Most recently, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act has been reauthorized by the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. This means that we're currently working with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act as amended by the Every Student Succeeds Act. When we talk about the law, you'll hear us say the ESEA, or we'll say ESSA, both are accurate. Laws passed by the legislature are generally known as statutes. The ESEA is the statute for the programs we will be discussing throughout this workshop. Laws created by agencies are called regulations. Regulations usually must be authorized by a statute and are also subordinate to them. However, they have the same legal force as statutes. For example, the ESCA statute created the Title I Part C migrant education program. The US Department of Education then created regulations that outlined the data elements that must be on the form used to determine migratory child eligibility. For many programs, the US Department of Education then issues non-regulatory guidance to clarify requirements in the statute and regulations. Non-regulatory guidance is not law, but it does provide the US Department of Education's interpretation of the statute and regulations. For example, the US Department of Education, Office of Migrant Education, issued non-regulatory guidance on migratory child eligibility. This was written in a question and answer format. Okay, another question for the audience. True or false? All ESCA programs are administered by deed. Give you a minute, go ahead and type your answer into the chat box. We might start including deed here. All ESCA programs are administered by deed. Oh, there we go, some answers in there. False, false, I hope not, false. All right, that is correct. The correct answer is false. A bonus for anyone that can also name an ESCA program not administered by deed. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of the ESCA programs more in depth. Next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. Some ESCA programs are administered by deed, meaning that the US Department of Education grants the funding to deed and then deed subgrants the funds to school districts or other organizations. When this occurs, deed is responsible for ensuring that the funds are being used appropriately and that the subgrantees are complying with the requirements of the statute and corresponding regulations. This slide shows each of the ESCA programs administered by deed that are within the ESCA consolidated application. You'll hear more about these programs in greater detail throughout the workshop, and you'll get the basics later today on most of these. There's Title 1A, Improving Basic Programs Operated by LEAs. Title 1C, Education of Migratory Children. Title 1D, Subpart 1, Prevention and Intervention Programs for Children and Youth who are neglected, delinquent, or at risk. Title 2A, Preparing, Training, and Recruiting High-Quality Teachers, Principals, and Other School Leaders. Title 3A, Language Instruction for English Learners and Immigrant Children. Title 4A, Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants. There are other ESCA programs that deed administers that are not part of your ESCA consolidated application. They are School Improvement, Title 1D, Subpart 2, Prevention and Intervention Programs for Children and Youth who are neglected, delinquent, or at risk. Title 4B, 21st Century Community Learning Centers, and McKinney-Vento Homeless Education Act, Education for Homeless Children and Youth. All right, so here are some ESCA programs that are not administered by deed. A bonus for those of you who guessed these, here are some you can check your answer. This means that the US Department of Education grants the funding directly to school districts or other organizations. So we have Title 5B, Rural Education Initiative, SRSA, and RLIS. I think I saw one of those in the chat box there. Title 6, Indian, Native, Hawaiian, and Alaska Native Education, and Title 7, Impact Aid. Oh, yeah, and Megan guessed Title 6 as well. Good job, you guys, with the bonus question. All right, and another question. Which subgroup of children does the Title III Part A program support? Is it migratory children, English learners, Alaska Native students, special education, or economically disadvantaged? Title III Part A. A couple B answers on there. B, B, E, L, E, L. Yep, you guys got it. English learners. Okay, next question. Which ESCA title program was created to support high poverty schools? Is it 2A, 1C, 4A, 3A, or 1A? Yeah, nice job, you guys. It's E, Title I, Part A. You guys did take notes from last year. Next question. Title IV Part A was designed to support effective use of technology, well-rounded education, safe and healthy schools, or all of the above? D, yeah, it is D. These are the 3 priority areas for Title IV. So all of those are correct. Which subgroup of children does the Title I Part C program support? Is it Alaska Native, economically disadvantaged, special education, migratory, or immigrant children? Lots of Ds. Yes, that is correct. Migratory students. Nice job. And one more question. Which ESSA title program was created to support educators? Is it 2A, 1C, 4A, 3A, or 1A? Yeah, you guys know your stuff. It is A, Title II, Part A. All right, so states apply for ESSA funding by submitting either a consolidated application or a program-specific application to the U.S. Department of Education. In a consolidated application, a state applies for many ESSA federal programs in a single application rather than submitting separate ones for each program. The Alaska Department of Education and Early Development has chosen to submit a consolidated application, also known as the ESSA state plan. The application covers the period that the ESSA is authorized. However, regardless of the length of time covered in the application, grants are made to states on an annual basis. The state is required to implement the ESSA in accordance with its approved application, subsequent amendments, and all applicable federal laws and regulations. The Alaska Department of Education and Early Development's current consolidated state plan can be found on the department's website, and that's education.alaska.gov/AKESSA. Again, I think you'll have access to the PDF from the live binder. If you want to click that link, you can download the PDF. The ESSA supports state efforts to establish challenging standards, develop aligned assessments, and build accountability systems for districts and schools that are based on educational results. In particular, the purpose of the Title I A program is to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education, and to close educational achievement gaps. Therefore, as a condition of receiving Title I A funds, states and districts must meet requirements related to academic standards, assessments, accountability, and reporting. Alaska's ESSA state plan outlines how Alaska will meet these statewide requirements. By accepting ESSA funds, DEED and school districts agree to carry out the requirements outlined in the statute and regulations. The U.S. Department of Education conducts compliance monitoring of states, and DEED conducts compliance monitoring of the school districts it subgrants ESSA funds to. When conducting ESSA compliance monitoring, DEED has 4 goals: to ensure compliance with federal statute and regulations, to build relationships with DEED and the district, provide technical assistance, and gather examples of practices, strategies that can be shared with other districts. We recommend that districts review and familiarize themselves with the ESSA monitoring form annually. The ESSA monitoring form can be found on DEED's form page at education.alaska.gov/forms. And a quick plug here, you can join me next Wednesday during the Lunch and Learn if you'd like to hear more about the ESSA monitoring process. So now that we have a high-level understanding of the ESSA, let's shift our focus to how federal funding works. A fiscal year is a 1-year period used for financial reporting and budgeting. The state and federal government have slightly different fiscal years. The state fiscal year runs from July 1 through June 30th of the following year. It is named for the calendar year in which it ends. For example, July 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2022 is state fiscal year 2022. The United States federal government's fiscal year is the 12-month period beginning October 1 and ending September 30th the following year. The identification of a fiscal year is the calendar year in which it ends. Thus, the current fiscal year in 2022, which began on October 1st, 2021, and will end on September 30th, 2022. All right. What would be the first day of state fiscal year 2023? What do you guys think? A, B, C, D, or E? I'll give you guys a second to read those answers there. A couple C guesses. Oh, lots of C guesses. Yep, that's correct. It is C. It is July 1st, 2022, which is just a few short months away. So this slide provides an overview of the availability of funds timeline. Each year, Congress appropriates funds to specific federal government departments, agencies, and programs. If Congress is unable to finalize appropriations by the beginning of the fiscal year, it can pass a continuing resolutions, or CR, that allows agencies and programs to continue operating until appropriations are completed. If Congress fails to pass an appropriation bill or continuing resolution, or if the president vetoes a passed bill, it may result in a government shutdown. In theory, a final appropriations bill would be signed into law by October 1st. In reality, Congress takes much longer to pass budget resolutions, and many years fail to do so. For example, Congress didn't have final FY21 appropriation until the end of December 2020. Even though funds are appropriated around October 1st, ESSA funds don't become available to states until July 1. States then generally have access to those funds for 27 months. This means FY21 federal funding appropriations are given to school districts in their FY22 allocations. Districts then have access to those funds from July 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. At the end of FY22, districts may be allowed to carry over some or all remaining funds into FY23 based on each program's rules. In general, any carryover would then be available to the district from July 1, 2022 through June 30th, 2023. Any remaining funds at the end of FY23 would then be forfeited by the district. DEED has until December 2023 to close out the grants. Timely quarterly reimbursement requests and final expenditure reports are extremely important to help ensure funds aren't forfeited. The Federal Uniform Grant Guidance, found under 2 CFR Part 200, are regulations that establish rules that apply to all federal grants, regardless of which federal agency is providing the award. This means the rules apply to not only U.S. Department of Education funding, but also other agencies such as the U.S. Department of Agriculture or USDA. The Uniform Grant Guidance, or UGG, provides uniform rules around several areas. I'll briefly cover just a few. UGG provides guidance on basic considerations to apply to all costs, listed or not listed. For example, when determining if something is allowable, we need to ensure that it's necessary, reasonable, and allocable or chargeable to the program. UGG requires all subrecipients of federal funds to document certain grant procedures. This includes written procedures around determining allowable costs, cash management, and conflict of interest. Additionally, UGG provides rules around procurement, time and effort, supplies and equipment management, indirect costs, and audits. You can see at the bottom of this slide, DEED has a federal grants management page where you can find resources related to UGG. All right, so we're going to take some time to go over the structure of DEED's ESSA team now. Each district's assigned a DEED staff member to be their ESSA lead. The ESSA lead is the main point of contact for your district regarding the ESSA consolidated application and ESSA monitoring. If the district receives Title 1A funds, the ESSA lead is also the district's Title 1A contact. Some benefits of the ESSA lead are they keep the ESSA consolidated application and monitoring process moving in a timely and organized way. They provide districts with a main point of contact to help eliminate confusion on who you should be reaching out to, and they ensure that communication is centralized and streamlined. You were provided a handout that lists each district and their corresponding ESSA lead at DEED, or it's available in the live binder, I believe. If you don't know yet, I would recommend taking some time to determine who your district's ESSA lead is, if for no other reason than to get the question right on the next slide. In addition to ESEA leads, DEED has program managers for each of the ESEA programs administered by DEED. They are responsible for overseeing the ESEA program statewide. So there's Courtney Preziosi, who's the ESEA Title I admin, Sarah Emmel, who's a Title I-A program manager and Title I-C program manager, me, Kelsey Smiley Rivera, Title I-A program manager. I'm also the private school ombudsman. We have Eli Barcy as another Title I-A program manager and the Title III-A program manager, Jessica Paris, Title I-A program manager, Title IV-B, foster care coordinator, and Title V coordinator. Cecilia Miller, Title I-D program manager, Title II-A program manager, and the homeless state coordinator. Cami Moore is our Title IV-A program manager, and Susan Forbes is the school improvement program manager. All right, we're down to our final question for this presentation. Who is your district's ESEA lead? Is it Courtney, Eli, Jessica, Sarah? Is it me? Is it Cecilia? Or you have no idea? Got a Courtney, Eli, Jessica, Courtney, me, Cecilia. I guess if you get it wrong, we'll try to help you figure out who your ESEA lead is. Yeah, Kay's got great enthusiasm there. Very happy to have Eli. Laurel, you have no clue. It's me. It's me. I'm Delta Greeley's. And LKSD, that's me too. All right, so on the screen, I've provided some links here to the ESSA statutes, Title I-A, I-C, and I-D regulations, and uniform grant guidance. Again, those links, well, they're there, but you can download the PDFs in the live binder, which have the links that you can just click on. Oh, and Courtney has put them in the chat there as well. Thank you, Courtney. A few other resources that may be helpful. There's DEED's ESEA federal programs webpage. You should be able to navigate to all the other ESEA program web pages from there. There's also the link to DEED's federal grants management webpage, which we talked about earlier, and the ESSA state plan page. And one final plug, we have a weekly ESEA newsletter. This newsletter provides information on program updates, reports, due dates, and resources. We highly recommend reading it through each week. If you do not receive this newsletter, please contact Jeannie Smith. Courtney has put her email address there in the chat box as well. And she can get you added to that newsletter. All right. That is the end. Do we have any questions? And we have the whole team here to help answer questions.
Hi, this is Megan in Nome, and I have a quick question, and that is, and it's probably out to the other federal programs coordinator folks. So when I get those DEED weekly things, no matter how many times I say not to promotions, and I click that little thing and on my email, they still go to promotions, and then I miss them. And I'm just wondering if anybody has a suggestion on how you get them to just come to your regular email. We use Google.
Yeah, we don't have that here. I'm not sure. Does anyone else, have Google with that same problem, or has found a solution? Anyone else on here?
Hi, this is Jenny in Fairbanks. Yeah, we had that issue when we first moved to Google last fall, and we did miss a few, and we noticed them. So as soon as we told Google several times that they aren't spam, then theoretically Google learns that it's not spam. Or I think you can mark it so it's not spam, something like that. I don't know.
And Yeah, that's what I've been doing, is marking it as not spam. And it seemed like it was working for a while. And then about 3, 4, 5 weeks ago, it started going back. And I wondered if you guys changed your system. I don't know. Anyway, I will take a look at it. I would Google it and see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we likewise have that problem.
Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
There's
this is
There's
Woody.
a
And
way in Google to say never send to spam. There's a couple bulletins that I don't read frequently, so Google assumes they're spam. So I create a filter to say never send these to the spam folder.
yeah,
Thank
and you might have already tried this, but you might drag from that promotions over into your inbox. And then if you drag it into there and it says, do you want to do this for all future notifications? And then that might help, but you might have already tried that also. So
I haven't tried that one, Woody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Megan, I hope you get that figured out.
Oh, yeah, no, I check my spam now often, but I will definitely try those suggestions.
Good, good. All right, Sherry, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute?
Hi, yes. Hi, Kelsey.
Hi, Sherry.
Who is our administrator? Because in GMS, I know Lucian, our business manager, is often asking who the administrator is that has to sign after the program manager.
So your grants administrator, or, oh, you mean the final?
Yeah,
Courtney Preziosi. Courtney is our deed administrator.
okay, so
So-
she signs off on GMS after you do, okay.
On the
All right.
final, on the first review, yes. On the original application approval, yes.
Okay, but not on the updates or revision?
Correct, not on revisions.
Okay, so that's not needed. And is that all the title programs or?
All the ones that are in the ESCA consolidated applications, but yeah,
Got it. Thank you.
you're welcome. Well, and with that, if there, let's see if I'm missing any other hands raised here. I don't think so. But I think I ended right on time, and I can pass it back over to Courtney.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kelsey. Perfect. All right. Well, good morning. Again, Courtney Preziosi. I'm the ESSA administrator here at the department. And today for the next half hour, I'm just going to talk about the Title 1A basics. So for most of you, you probably already know this, but Title 1A is the U.S. Department of Ed's largest K-12 grant program, and it provides supplemental funding to help low-income schools improve the academic achievement of educationally disadvantaged children or students. And historically, there has been about $17 billion appropriated nationally, and typically it brings in about approximately $47 million to the state of Alaska. Chris, can you go to the next slide? So just a quick highlight of what I will be talking about today. I'll just start with our state Title 1A allocations, and then we'll dive down into the district Title 1A allocations. I'll give a brief overview of the Title 1A program. I'll highlight some Title 1A resources, and then we could open it up for some questions and discussion. Next slide. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the state Title 1A allocations. And Chris, if you could go to the next slide. All right. So the U.S. Department of Education annually to issue or allocate funds to states, they will use the most recent census data. So in order to calculate our 22-23 or state FY 23 allocations, they'll use the most recent state census data. And an important factor to examine is each state's relative share of the total number of poverty children nationally. So an increase or a decrease in our state's relative share typically provides an early indication of the extent to which a state may experience a gain or a loss of Title 1A funds for the upcoming fiscal year. And Chris, next slide. So back in December of 2021, the census released 2020 district poverty estimates that they will use for the state fiscal year 23 Title 1A and Title 2A allocations. And they began a 90-day challenge period back in December. So it's important to note that the 2020 district poverty estimates are unaffected by the 2020 decennial census, or the census that occurs every 10 years. And as you can see on this, as you can see on this slide, the yellow or the orange, depending on what color you think that is, Alaska did experience a decrease of our poverty share nationally. So next slide. Okay.
Hey, Courtney, not to interrupt, but I can't see the slides. I see you.
I can see the slides. Is anybody else having an issue with not seeing the slides?
I can see the slides, Courtney.
Okay. Woody, I'm not sure what.
I can see them also.
Okay.
Sorry, it must be me. Maybe I've got you pinned or something. Okay, thanks. Sorry for
Jeannie,
interrupting.
do you mind private messaging Woody and maybe providing some support? The color is goldenrod. Thank you, Meg. Too funny. Okay, well, hopefully Jeannie can help. I'm not really quite sure why you're not seeing the slide. Sorry about that. Okay, so recently Congress passed an omnibus appropriations bill for the upcoming fiscal year. So for what we call our state fiscal year 23. And the legislation provides a slight boost to education funding, but the final appropriations differ dramatically from proposals in the House and the Senate from last summer. So if you were following last summer, there was a proposal that would have nearly doubled the funding for Title I under ESSA. But instead, most programs will see an increase of around 6 to 8% at the national level, so just enough to keep up with the rate of inflation. So as you can see here, the preliminary estimate for our state is about 50 million, which is an estimated increase of about 3 million from the FY22 actual. And in calculating the preliminary allocations for states, the U.S. Department of Education uses, so as I mentioned in the previous slide, they use the income year 2020 census estimates based on the district boundaries as they existed in that fiscal year. And then the U.S. Department of Ed also uses that same October 2020 state reported non-census data. So they use census data and non-census data, and that non-census data includes the number of children in locally operated neglected or delinquent institutions, foster homes, and then families that are above the poverty receiving assistance under TANF, or the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. So all of that, they've used census, non-census data. And then I included a link on this slide to the budget tables, and I do want to note, so the U.S. Department of Ed, they do post the budget tables. And if you navigate to that website, you are going to see that they use federal fiscal years. So Kelsey mentioned that in her slide. So the number you're going to look at for this upcoming fiscal year is federal fiscal year 2022. And you might, if you were like me, you'll scratch your head a little bit and wonder why the number that they have in that budget table looks different than the number that I have here on the screen. And the reason being is that a full appropriation for the programs administered by US Ed was not enacted at the time the budget request was prepared. So therefore, the budget request assumes that the programs are operating under the continuing resolution, which was in effect at the time of preparation. So the numbers different. Yeah, so the FY22, this federal fiscal year 2022, so that number that you're going to look at, it reflects the continuing resolution and not the full year appropriation that was subsequently enacted. Next slide, perfect. The U.S. Department of Ed expects to release final allocations in June, which will differ from the preliminary allocations. And that's for a couple reasons. So that's because of updates to the annually collected counts of children in locally operated institutions for neglected and delinquent children, foster homes, and the families that receive assistance under TANF. And then there might be additional differences if states were to report revisions to its state per pupil expenditure data. That's also part of the allocation methodology that the US Department of Ed uses to allocate Title I-A funds to states. Next slide. So a lot of districts ask, like, what does that mean at the district level? You know, the state of Alaska is receiving, possibly receiving a $3 million increase. And really the Title I-A district allocations are reliant on many factors, and unfortunately estimates are not known at this time. And if you've been around for a couple of years, typically what we do when the US Department of Ed issues their final allocations to DEED in June, we kind of quickly run the numbers based on the information and the data that we have. And what I will typically do, and what other program managers will typically do, is if your district is expected to experience a significant increase or a significant decrease, typically what we like to do is give you a little bit of a heads up, and that's for planning purposes. So expect possibly an email from me in late June if your district is going to experience a significant difference from your fiscal year allocation from last year. All right, next slide. Okay, so I talked about how USCD allocates the Title I funds to states, and I do want to talk about how DEED allocates Title I funds to districts. So next slide. So the US Department of Ed approves the use of an alternative formula to distribute Title I-A funds to districts with fewer than 20,000 total residents. So this method was originally approved back in 1999, and that was renewed in 2002. And essentially the formula count is a weighted number derived from both census poverty data, as well as Alaska public assistance data for children ages 5 through 17. Next slide. Okay. So if you have if you're familiar with the Title I-A allocation, it does have 4 parts. The parts are the basic grant, the concentration grant, the targeted grant, and the education finance incentive grants. So each of the 4 formulas or parts of the Title I-A allocation, it does take into consideration the hold harmless rates, any administration reserves that DEED takes off the top before allocating to districts. The Title I-D subpart 2, the neglected and delinquent set aside, is also part of our Title I-A allocation, as well as the Title I-A school improvement or any state academic achievement awards. So each of the statutory formulas, they do have varying eligibility criteria. But essentially, in order to qualify for parts of the Title I-A allocation, the district must have a weighted poverty. So we talked about what that was. It's census and public assistance data. You must have a weighted poverty greater than 10 children, which is the minimum threshold for receiving a basic Title I-A grant. And we do have a couple districts that kind of fall from year to year, fall below that, that threshold. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, we do like to give districts as much warning as we can if you're going to kind of fall off that eligibility criteria. Next slide. Okay. So next I'm going to talk about an overview of the Title I-A formula. So we talked about how the US Department of Ed allocates to DEED, how DEED allocates to districts. But then how do districts and schools use their Title I-A funds? So I just want to briefly highlight that in the next couple slides. All right. So the purpose of Title I is to provide all children a significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high quality education, and to close the educational achievement gaps. So to achieve that, states must develop accountability systems to identify and support schools with academically struggling students, and districts and schools must use their Title I funds to improve student outcomes, including academic achievement. So on this slide, I have a side by side with the Alaska Education Challenge logo, because the reality is that the 1A purpose and DEED's mission, which is an excellent education for every student every day, really go hand in hand. Next slide. So Title I and other federal programs have the following general spending considerations. And you often, if you've communicated with DEED, you might be familiar with some of these questions that we ask districts when we're reviewing your applications. So the first one here, is this cost necessary? So is the cost included and identifiable in your district's plan? And is it allowable under the program? So is it included in your district plan, your school-wide plan, or your targeted assistance plan, or your school improvement plan? And is it reasonable? So is the cost generally recognized as ordinary? And does the nature and amount not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances? And often you'll hear us use the word allocable. So will this item benefit Title I in the proportion of the percentage that Title I pays for this item? And will any use by another program be allocated out of it? And is it so is what is being paid for by Title I allocable to the program? Does it conform to EDGAR? So is the cost permitted under the Education Department General Administrative Regulations and not disallowed under the 55 specific items of cost? And does it follow the terms and conditions of the grant? So is the cost permitted and allowed under the grant award notification? Is the Title I cost, is it consistent with state and local policies? So is the item permissible under state and local laws and policies? Is it provided consistent treatment? So is the item not included in your district's indirect cost rate? Is it adequately documented? So did you make sure to maintain documentation of the need, the purpose, and the use of the item consistent with these rules? And is your item supplemental? So for example, if the cost is a school level expense, does the district have a Title I-A neutral methodology? All right, next slide. Okay, so this is a quick knowledge check. So in the chat, I want you to answer this question. So can Title I-A pay for food costs? Is your answer yes? Is it no? Is it depends? Give it a couple seconds. I see a couple, it depends. I see a no. All right. So really the answer, if you wrote it depends, you are correct. So it really depends. The U.S. Department of Ed, the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education released a guidance letter in 2014 that outlines the very high burden of proof to show that paying for food and beverages with federal funds is necessary to meet the goals and the objectives for a federal award. So according to this guidance, the U.S. Department of Education considers it unlikely that anything but a working lunch, so that includes breakfasts, snacks, dinners, and networking receptions, would be allowable. To determine whether a working lunch is allowable, the following factors must be considered. So is the working lunch necessary? Is there a genuine time constraint that requires the working lunch? If a working lunch is necessary, is the cost of the working lunch reasonable? And has the district carefully documented that a working lunch is both necessary and reasonable? And in addition, according to the U.S. Department of Ed guidance, a district may provide light refreshments as a way to encourage parents of Title I-A students to participate in school activities. So quite often districts will ask for a reasonable and necessary cost for food or light refreshments as it relates to parent and family engagement activities. All right, next slide. So using Title I-A funds at the district level. So before allocating Title I-A funds to schools, districts must reserve some Title I-A funds for the following required activities. So districts must reserve funds for services for homeless children and youth. You could reserve funds for children in local institutions for neglected children, and if appropriate, services for children in local institutions for delinquent children and neglected or delinquent children in community day programs. Districts could also reserve funds for parent and family engagement. So if you have a Title I-A allocation greater than $500,000, you're required to reserve at least 1%. And then also districts that have private schools in your boundaries, you must consult with your private schools. And if private schools elect to participate in Title I-A, you're required to provide equitable services for eligible private school students. Next slide. And then this slide goes over or highlights some optional reservations. So districts may also reserve funds before allocating Title I-A funds to schools. You can reserve funds for the following discretionary activities. So that's transportation for students in CSI schools. If the district offers these students the option to transfer to another school, you could also offer financial incentives and awards to teachers in CSI or TSI schools for the purposes of attracting and retaining qualified and effective teachers. You could also offer early childhood education programs for eligible children. We have a lot of districts in our state that do that. You could also reserve funds for additional costs needed to transport children in foster care to their school of origin, consistent with section 1112C5. You can reserve funds for administering to the Title I-A program. A lot of districts in our state, they'll send funds to the CAP for the purposes of administering other program or all of your ESSA programs. And then you can reserve funds for district managed initiatives in Title I schools. Next slide. Okay. So we talked about reserving funds at the district level, but then let's transition and talk about allocating Title I-A funds to schools. So districts allocate Title I-A funds through a process known as ranking and serving. So essentially, districts rank schools from highest poverty to lowest poverty, and then distribute Title I-A funds to schools in order of poverty. And if you're going to stick around next week, I'm going to go a little deeper because ranking and serving is a quite complicated process. And I'm going to go a little deeper into that process in my 1A presentation next week, I believe on Tuesday. I'm discussing that. So looking at a glance at what districts do, we have some districts that grade band. I know that the Juneau School District does that. They serve elementary schools. We have other districts that only serve all of their schools above 75% poverty. We have some districts that exempt schools. So Title I-A allows you to exempt certain schools from allows you to exempt them from serving, being served, and our GMS handbook, our application handbook as well. So there's a couple of guidance documents, and then we have a handbook that goes into all the rules. Again, it's a quite complicated process. Okay. So next, I want to talk about the scope of Title I-A services. So there's been a long-held misconception that Title I's goal is to improve outcomes for academically at-risk students, and then we largely measure that academic performance on academic assessments, and that Title I-A funds have to be limited to those subjects tested on those assessments, so generally reading and math. But ESSA really tries to clarify that Title I really isn't that limited. So Title I funds can be used to support a wide range of activities that help improve student outcomes. And that includes providing eligible students with a well-rounded education, instructional supports, as well as non-instructional supports like behavior and mentoring supports, and social emotional learning, as well as improving school quality. Next slide. So schools that receive Title I funds must design and implement programs to support eligible Title I students using one of two models. So both program models are focused on improving performance for struggling students, but they represent two different ways of doing it. So in a school-wide model, the school has a little more flexibility to improve aspects of its educational programs in ways that might help all students in the school. Through those school-wide schools have the option to serve all students. That doesn't mean that they have to. So it still might make sense to focus in on a specific group of students. And in most cases, schools won't have enough funding to reach all students, but a school operating a school-wide program has more flexibility in which students it can target its funds for. In a school-wide school, all students are considered Title I students. And school-wide schools must develop a plan describing the services they will provide based on a comprehensive assessment of the school's needs. So this needs assessment must take into account the academic achievement of all students, particularly the needs of the students struggling to meet state academic standards and any other factors as determined by the district. And then a targeted assistance model. So in a targeted assistance model, services are limited to students that are identified based on academic need. Children are served, who are served are those who are identified as failing or most at risk of failing. Schools essentially develop a list of specific students and services that are targeted to those students on the list. And schools operating a targeted assistance model must use Title I funds to help educationally disadvantaged students meet the state standards. Next slide. So I quickly wanted to do a quick slide side by side of the requirements. So as I mentioned, each Title I school must have a school-wide plan. There's also an opportunity to request a waiver. So if you have a school that's below 40% poverty and wants to operate a school-wide school, there is a waiver. And then that Title I, if you have historically used your school improvement plan as your school-wide plan, in the past, we've had this assurances document that schools have used and filled out in order to use their school improvement plan as their school-wide plan. And then if you're operating a targeted assistance school, you must keep on file your selection criteria, your student lists of who you're serving, and your site plan. And that's typically what we ask for during our ESSA monitoring. Next slide. Okay. We're going to do another quick knowledge check. So the question here is, can I use my district Title I funds to support a preschool program in a targeted assistance school? Yes or no? You can type that answer into the chat. If you've got a school operating a targeted assistance model, can you use Title I funds for a preschool program? I see a yes, I see a yes. Give it a couple more seconds. I see another yes. If the needs support it, yep, that's a good point. All right. So if your answer was yes, you're correct. So yes, if kindergarten readiness is in the school's needs assessment and is included in the Title I plan, you can use your Title I funds to support a preschool program in a targeted assistance school. But so just a note, so since this is a targeted assistance school, only eligible students will be permitted to participate. So the school should maintain records of the eligibility process and student lists and show only eligible students attend the preschool. It is a supplemental cost since Title I uses a supplement not supplant test based on a methodology for allocations. And lastly, preschool is an allowable cost under Title I. So if you operate school-wide schools, you could also use Title I funds for, or if you operate school-wide schools, you could also use your Title I funds for a preschool program. Okay, next slide. So before, in one of my previous slides, I briefly mentioned the Alaska Education Challenge when I talked about the Title I purpose. And here on this slide, I have the 5 shared priorities. So supporting all students to read at grade level by the end of 3rd grade, increased career, technical, and culturally relevant education to meet student and workforce needs, close the achievement gap by ensuring equitable educational rigor and resources, prepare, attract, and retain effective education professionals, improve the safety, well-being of students through school partnerships and families, communities, and tribes. So I want you to take a minute looking at these 5 shared priorities. How does your district and the schools within your district use its Title I funds to address Alaska's education challenge? Once you've had a minute, type that into the chat. I'd love to have other districts see how you're using your funds to support the Alaska Education Challenge. So how are you using funds to support reading? How are you using your funds to support CTE, recruitment and retention? I'd be very curious to see, to hear how districts are using their Title I funds and to share that out with others. Oh, sorry, my mic was off. I apologize. Okay, so I don't know what you heard, but Delta Greeley is using their Title I funds for K-5 reading, and then others are done under other ESSA programs. I see that in Fairbanks, they're using their Title I funds for instructional coaches, professional development, supplemental materials, family engagement. In Nome, they're using their funds for salary and benefits for a reading specialist at an elementary school. In Kodiak, I see reading and math interventions, instructional coaches, professional development, family resource program. Haines, same as Nome. In Valdez, they're using their funds to pay for a Title I teacher for K-2 and after the bell program. In Ketchikan, I see classroom size reduction teachers in Title I schools. Awesome. I mean, these are really great. Alaska Gateway, I see pay support staff at district sites, as well as family engagement event staff, spelling bee and Battle of the Book staff, curriculum committees. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, these are great uses of Title I funds. In Delta Greeley, they're using their Title I funds to support English learners. Awesome. Well, feel free to continue typing those into the chat. I would love for you to continue sharing with other districts, but I'm gonna move on because I think I'm running a little low on time. But I appreciate all the wonderful ideas that are being put into the chat. Okay, so next I'm going to transition to some Title I-A resources before I conclude the Title I-A basics presentation. So recently on all of our ESSA pages, we tried to include all important dates. So I included a link here. And again, if you've got the link to the PDF for this presentation, you've got the actual, you've got the link to this, to the slide, or the slide has the link, sorry. But on our Title I-A page specifically, we tried to highlight some of the key due dates or deadlines as it relates to the Title I-A program. I would encourage you to print this out or bookmark this website. It's got some important reminders for all of your Title I-A due dates throughout the year. Next slide, please, Chris. And then 6 minutes with ESSA. We've developed these a couple years ago, and they're just quick 6-minute clips on all of these topics. And if you're new or fairly new, I would highly encourage you to listen to these. I think they're really helpful. Provides a brief high-level overview of the requirements here on this slide. And even if you're a veteran federal program staff, I think it's always nice to have a quick refresher. Next slide. Okay, on our DEED website, so we've got a Title I-A spending handbook. We developed that a couple years. That lives on our website, and that goes over key spending considerations as it relates to Title I. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, I highly encourage you to bookmark that as well. And then on our forms page, we've got a couple of templates that I think are really helpful. So if you've got Title I funds, which most of our districts have, each district is required to have a district parent and family engagement policy. And each school that operates a Title I or receives Title I funds must also have a school parent and family engagement policy. And so we've got those 2 templates on our website, and you're more than welcome to use those and adapt those to your school and district needs. If your schools operate a school-wide plan, I know that I mentioned this in a previous slide, but we have a school-wide plan template. We've also got the waiver. So if you have schools that fall below that 40% threshold, you can submit a waiver to deed, and we can review and determine whether the school would be eligible to operate a school-wide school. Each school must have a school parent compact. We have that template. And then the monitoring indicator form. So if you've been around at your district and you've been part of the monitoring form highlights all of the requirements. So not just Title I, but all of our ESEA programs. I would really encourage you to take a look at that document if you haven't already done so. I know that several districts, they use that as kind of like a self-monitoring, even on years that they're not being monitored, they go through and they make sure that they're compliant with each of the indicators in that form. That lives on our deed website. We also update that from year to year. I mean, typically there aren't major updates, but we do look at that annually and revise it accordingly. Next slide. Okay, so we're at the point, and I think I'm almost right at time, but are there any questions? Any questions that anybody has? I see there was a question about the timeline, and that link went into the chat. If we have one.
Courtney, I can read this one
Yeah.
for you.
Okay, sounds good.
If we have a 1 school district, should we use the school or the district engagement template?
I actually think, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, we developed like a single site parent, and I don't know if we have that publicly posted, but kind of like a single site parent family engagement policy that I'll need to confirm whether we've finalized that, but I think recently we actually distributed that to a district. So Rhonda, I can connect with you because I'm actually your Title I program manager. Because there are some, the policies are not identical, and we tried to combine it so that it included the requirements of the district as well as the school. But that's a good question. Any other questions? I don't see any in the chat unless I'm missing.
I don't think you're missing any, Courtney.
Okay. So this,
one just
go ahead.
in.
Yeah.
When will the slide deck be published? Sorry, you can answer that.
Yeah, so the slide deck is right now on the live binder. And so the live binder has, and the main smart sheet that you probably navigated to find the Zoom link, there's a live binder tab, and that's where all of we've got like 95% of the presentations for this week and next uploaded. So that's where you can find the live slide deck. Okay. All right. Well, Chris, can you go to the next slide? So here on this slide, we've got 5 program managers, including myself, 1A program managers. And I know that Kelsey in her presentation talked about lead program managers. So each person here, myself, Jessica, Eli, Sarah, and Kelsey, we all have a handful of Title I districts that we're the lead for. We are your point of contact as it relates to Title I and your application in its entirety. So don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to answer your questions and more than happy to support in any way that we can. And I think that is my last slide. Yep, awesome. So on the agenda right now, we've got a quick 5-minute break if you need to stretch your legs, fill up your water, grab a quick snack. So I'm looking at the time. I think I went 2 minutes over time, but let's come back in 5 minutes. So why don't we come back at like 11:12, and then Sarah will start with her Title I-C presentation. So see you in 5 minutes.
All right, it looks like it is 11:12, so we'll come back from break. I hope that everyone was able to stretch their legs and get really energized for the migrant program, the coolest program, I would say. So today we'll be talking about the basics of the Title I-C migrant education program. And my name is Sarah Emmel, and I am the program manager. I oversee this program, and on the line today is also the rest of the migrant team, and I'll introduce them at the end of this presentation. So before we get going and I'm talking about the program, I want to know the experience in the crowd. How long have you worked with the migrant program? Put that into the chat. I know there's some people that have been working for a few years. I recognize familiar names. I see less than 1 year. It is a big learning curve, so don't worry, Rhonda, if you feel like there's a lot to the migrant program. It takes some time to learn. I feel like I'm still learning new things, and I've worked with the migrant program for about 8 years now. So we have quite a few less than 1 year people. So that's great. I'm really happy that you're able to attend this and learn a little bit more about the migrant program. So on the agenda today, I'll be giving a brief overview of the program. We'll talk about state allocations, district grants. We'll talk about the continuous improvement cycle of the migrant program. We'll shift and talk about some district program requirements, 5 considerations of determining if it's an allowable use of Title I-C funds, and then we'll end with some resources. So let's get right into the overview. On the screen, I have provided you with the legal references for the migrant program. The Title I-C program is authorized by the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and can be found in 1301 through 1309 of the law. There are also regulations for the Title I-C program, and they can be found at 34 CFR 200.81 through 0.89. And then the migrant program has both non-regulatory guidance, and they also have some policy Q&As that are found on their results.ed.gov website. So these are just some resources if you want to dive even deeper into the program. So what is the goal of the migrant program? It is to ensure that all migratory children reach challenging academic standards and graduate with a high school diploma that prepares them for responsible citizenship, further learning, and productive employment. And I think that this is a really great goal for the program. And when we're planning our programs, that we should really take time and reflect on what is the program, why are we doing what we're doing? And it's really to help these children graduate and be ready for the next phase of their lives. But who is a migratory child? And on this screen is a deceptively simple definition of a migratory child. We spend about a week in the fall teaching recruiters and records managers about how to identify and recruit a migratory child. It's complex, and there's a lot of if, ands, or buts, but the definition in a simple format is they're a child who is entitled to free public education, or they're not yet in school, and that child made a qualifying move due to an economic need in the past 3 years, and they made that move as a migratory agricultural worker or fisher, or with or to join a parent, guardian, or spouse who is a migratory agricultural worker or migratory fisher. But what does that even mean? And so it really a example of what this could look like in Alaska, in an Alaska context, is a family who travels together to fish camp or to commercial fish in the summer due to an economic need, and they'll either bring home fish to be a large portion of their food intake for the year, or they rely on the funding that they receive from the commercial fishing to get by. So it's families who are moving for fishing and coming back home in the summer from after the summer fishing. And that's just a general example of what it looks like in Alaska. So let's talk about how we get funds from the U.S. Department of Education at the state level. So we have to first talk about the federal reporting that we do for the migrant program. So each year in December, we provide specific migrant counts to the U.S. Department of Education. These counts are around a performance period. So it's not a fiscal year, it's a performance period, which is a little odd. And it's September 1 through August 31st. So each year we're looking at that particular performance period. And within that performance period, we have two counts. We have the category 1 count, which is a 1-year count. And in order for a child to be included in that count, they must be eligible for at least 1 day during that September 1st through August 31st period. And they must have been in the state for at least 1 day during that period. So we get a whole count of all the children that were in the state during that performance period. So that's category 1. Category 2 is a subset of category 1, and that is the children who received summer services, during this summer. So those are the two types of counts that we do. Then once we report that to the federal government, they run it through a funding formula, and that is the category 1 child count. They'll take the past 3 years of count, so that's the 1-year count. They'll look at the past 3 years and they'll average it. They'll add it together, add it with the previous 1-year summer count, and then they'll take 40% of our state per pupil expenditures, and that all gets put together to give us a state allocation. But if you go to the next slide, here's an example of the data that's used for our upcoming allocations that we will receive on July 1 for fiscal year 23. So they'll be looking at our 1-year counts for 18-19, 19-20, and 20-21. They'll average those full year counts. Then they'll be looking at just the previous last summer services counts. They'll be looking at our average per pupil expenditures that they take from NCES, and then the U.S. Department of Education makes any necessary judgment adjustments to the program or to the allocations based on corrections that were made to federal reporting from the previous year. So they'll make states whole, essentially, if there were any adjustments that need to be made. So once we've received the allocations on July 1, we break the funds out into 3 pots. The first is for just general administration. We hold some to the side for that, and that's monitoring, application reviews, just general administrative tasks. We hold some funds at the state level also for some unique expenses to the migrant program, and that includes our statewide identification and recruitment trainings. We have a migrant student database, and those are unique administrative costs to the program. And then the rest of the funding, and by far the majority of the funding, goes out to subgrants to school districts. And here's what everyone always wants to know: what's our allocation of the state for the upcoming year? And so on the screen, I have the last several years allocations, as well as the preliminary allocation for FY23. And we are, as a state, looking to receive about a $1.4 million increase from last year. I want to make the note that this is preliminary, and just because we as a state are receiving an increase does not mean that your district will necessarily see an increase because of how the formula works, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. So we're going to do a quick knowledge check. So in the chat, true or false, states report counts of migratory children every 3 years. Do we report to the federal government every 3 years? True or false? I see some falses. And you would be accurate. The answer is false. We report our child counts to the U.S. Department of Education annually. We do it in December, and that's why it's so important for us to do our annual recruitment by November 15th each year. There's a very large push where we're telling districts, please get your recruitment done so that we have complete numbers to provide to the U.S. Department of Education in December each year. I love the emoji. So now we know how we're getting funds at the state level, but how do districts get funds? The deed provides subgrants to districts in a few different ways. First, we have a formula that we give out in the ESSA consolidated application. That's the largest pot of funding for districts. And then we also have some state activity grants that we give to districts. First is the migrant literacy grant. I think this is a fan favorite for districts. It's funding that is to get literacy and books into the hands of migratory children. Most districts that receive Title I-C funds have a literacy grant. If you have questions, you can reach out to Chris Mariano about that. We also have two other pots of fundings that we give out sometimes. One is if your district nominated a parent to be part of our State Parent Advisory Council and we're having an in-person meeting, we'll give that district a grant so that they can fund that parent coming to our state PAC meeting. And then during the years in which we have fall training, we pay for districts to come to training. Unfortunately, this fall, we don't have, we're not doing fall training in person, so we will not be giving fall training staff development grant. In the chat, I don't see migrant literacy in GMS for 23. You will not see a migrant literacy grant in GMS for 23 yet. We will be filling out the paper applications to see if your district wants to have a migrant literacy grant in FY23. And then once we have the allocations, we will put the money into GMS and you'll be able to budget it then. So that probably will not happen until closer to July because it's such a small and much more simple budget. We don't open it extremely early like we do for other applications. And then will there be PAC money again from Megan? That Chris will work to reshare, but we will, that is still being decided if we're going to have an in-person PAC meeting next year. So we will be working with those districts that have a parent representative if they want to have we'll be working with the districts that have PAC representatives if we choose to have in-person meetings in FY23. But at this time, we do not have that planned. Did the slides disappear for anyone else, or is that just me?
Yeah, it sounds like she lost her internet connection. So I can maybe what I'll do is I'll share the slides. Let me pull them up.
I feel like all the technical issues always happen to me. It just really
it happens.
It happens, and I thank you all for bearing with us during our technical issues.
Okay, let me just give it a second.
They're testing me. It's what they're doing. They're getting me back.
Sarah, what
we're on I think it's going to be like the district funding formula elements. I'm moving forward to that.
District funding formula element. Okay, perfect. Let me get there.
No problem. Well, I can just start talking. So we going back to the funding formula that we give to districts, we take into consideration several things when we're working through that funding formula. We look at the needs of the district for identification and recruitment of migratory children. We look at availability of other funds, and that's taken from the audits that we receive each year from districts. We look at the number of children that were served during the regular school year and during the summer, as well as children not served. We look at the number or the proficiency rates of migratory children from the state summative assessments, as well as the number of migratory children identified as priority for services. So a lot of different elements go into the funding formula, but really, it's a really important factor to take away is we're looking at numbers of migratory children, services, and achievement on state summative assessments. Those are the three kind of big pillars to take away from the formula. Next slide. So let's do a quick knowledge check. Identification and recruitment of migratory children plays a large role in districts' Title I allocations. True or false? See some trues. And you would be accurate if you had said true. A big pillar of the migrant program is finding and serving migratory children. And if you don't have a large population, recruited into your district, we won't be able to give you the allocation you need to provide services. All right, next slide. Let's talk about the migrant program continuous improvement cycle. Next slide. So in the migrant program, and I think most ESSA programs, we have a cycle that we are doing both at the state level and at the district level, and it's called the continuous improvement cycle. First, we have to do a comprehensive needs to get an understanding of the unique educational needs of migratory children that result from their lifestyle. Once we determine the needs, we make a plan of how we're going to provide services to address those needs, and that's called a service delivery plan. And within that service delivery plan, we're creating measurable program goals, so some SMART goals, as well as determining strategies and services that we're going to provide in order to address those needs. And then once we provide those services and do that programming that we planned in the service delivery plan, we need to evaluate the effectiveness of the program. So we're going to be looking at, did we, meet our goals? And then did we implement the program like we said we were going to? This is happening both at the state and district level. Next slide. At the state level, we do it on a slower basis than districts. Districts, this is an annual process, but at the state, we do it every few years. And on our Title I-C webpage, we have a statewide needs assessment, a statewide service delivery plan, as well as our most recent evaluation report. But I want to talk quickly about the service delivery plan. All districts need to align their services to our state service delivery plan. So within our service delivery plan, we have various strategies in which we need to align our uses of funds to. And if you have looked at your application, your ESSA consolidated application, Title I-C program details, you'll notice there's quite a few check boxes with a lot of narrative of strategies, and those strategies come directly from our state service delivery plan. So your uses of funds will need to align to those strategies. Next slide. So quick knowledge check. Local migrant education programs must create local measurable program outcomes. True or false? That is you guys are really hard to trick today, but yes, the all districts need to be providing or creating their own local goals, because you'll have your own local services and your own local baselines in which you're measuring your local programs against. Next slide. So let's talk briefly about some district program requirements. So by accepting Title I-C funds, districts are agreeing to do a variety of different activities. And on the screen are the big pieces of the migrant program. So first, districts are responsible for identifying and recruiting migratory children into the program. Next, districts are required to have strong data quality controls, both for when they're recruiting children, as well as making sure that all the data that you provide to the department is accurate and timely. Next is some interstate coordination. So the migrant population is quite, they transition from school to school and district to district frequently. So we need to have processes in place to assist children as they move from state to state and district to district and school to school. We are also responsible for engaging parents and families in the planning and operation of the migrant program. And the next two bullets we've already talked about, but districts are responsible for identifying and addressing needs of migratory children, as well as evaluating the effectiveness of their local programs. Next slide. Districts are also required to have various written documents, and those include having a written identification and recruitment plan, a quality control plan, having your needs assessment documented, your service delivery plan, and your evaluation plan documented. We don't mandate on how those are documented, but we do have a guiding documents template for districts that help guide them through writing all of these required documents for the program, and I highly encourage you to use the template. I think the districts that have taken the time and worked through this template have found it to be very useful, as well as helping them with when we come to monitor. And if you ever need assistance with writing any of these documents or using our guiding documents template, please do not hesitate to reach out and we can support you in that. I'll just do another plug. If you were listening to this morning, Kelsey talked about monitoring, as well as there'll be a monitoring presentation next week. But I really encourage you to take some time and look at our monitoring documents and familiarize yourself with the Title I-C section. It really walks you through all of the requirements of the program and helps set you up for success when we come to monitor your district. All right, another knowledge check. Districts must engage parents and guardians of migratory children in the planning and operation of their local migrant education program. Yes, that is exactly correct. True. You'll see a theme between all of the ESSA programs. It's really important that we're working with parents in the planning of operation of all of our programs, because they are the partners and they're the parents of the children, and treating them like partners really has really can make your program go far. Next slide. Oh, I see in the question in the chat, is there a monitoring calendar listing when a district will be monitored? I don't believe we have the districts that we're going to be monitoring in the coming year finalized yet. And I will let Kelsey speak to that next week during her monitoring presentation. Kelsey, when is your presentation again? Can you?
It is, I think, Wednesday. Yes, Wednesday at 12 o'clock for the Lunch and Learn. I'll be talking more about that and the how we decide which districts will be monitored.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelsey. All right, so we're going to quickly talk about some considerations that you need to work through when determining if you can use Title I-C funds for a particular activity or service. So the first two things that we need to work through are around identified needs and strategies. So you first need to ask yourself, does this activity or service address a need identified in the state comprehensive needs assessment? And is it aligned to the strategies in our state service delivery plan? If the answer is no, then we wouldn't be able to use our Title I-C funds for that. The next question is, are the funds being used to meet the identified needs that result from a child's migratory lifestyle and permit them to participate effectively in school? And this really points back to the purpose of the program, that the end result, we're just trying to get these children, graduated from high school and prepared for the next phase of their lives. Next slide. The next two are about other available resources. So first, does the activity or service supplement and not supplant non-federal funds? So that means in the absence of Title I-C funds, would you be doing this activity or service? And if your answer is yes, then you can't use Title I-C funds for that because they would be supplanting. Number 4 is similar, and it is the activity already addressed by services available from other federal or non-federal programs? And this gets at the need to look at all the programs available to migratory children in your district and to make sure that migratory children are, signed up for those programs first before applying Title I-C funds on top of that. And that's for federal and non-federal programs. Next slide. And then finally, this is for all ESSA programs. It needs to, align with the Uniform Grant Guidance cost principles. So are the costs reasonable and necessary and allocable or chargeable to the MEP relative to the benefit received? And I won't go too deeply into that because I believe Kelsey and Courtney have already talked to that this morning. Next slide. On the screen are some general allowable uses of Title I-C funds. So you can use your Title I-C funds to administer the program. Costs around identification and recruitment of migratory children. You can use your Title I-C funds to help with your local needs assessment, service delivery planning, and your evaluation activities. A big part of your Title I-C funds will be around providing supplemental services to migratory children. And those services can be both instructional services and support services. You can use your Title I-C funds for parent and family engagement, as well as professional development for your staff to help them address needs of migratory children. Next slide. So this is something that has been coming up a lot in the last few years, the blending and braiding. So I want to take a moment to define what blending is and define what braiding is, because I believe sometimes people interchange the terms. So blending is when funds from multiple sources are combined for a common activity. And the identity of all the different funds no longer exists. They are one pot of funding. And in order to blend funds, it must be authorized under statute. Braiding, on the other hand, is when funds from multiple sources are joined to contribute to a common activity, and they keep their identities, but they're working together to meet or to carry out a program or activity. So if we'll go to the next slide, here are some examples of blending versus braiding. So blending, some common examples is when we consolidate our ESSA funds for administration. So when you're using the consolidated admin pool, that's considered blending funds. Or when those particular schools consolidate their Title I-C funds into their Title I-A program after meeting very specific program criteria, and that's considered blending. Braiding, on the other hand, is, here are some examples that are directly from the U.S. Department of Education, so I'll read them to you. MEP funds pay for the cost of an additional teacher to increase the number of migratory children served in a district summer program. So you're expanding a summer program so more children can participate. So you're coordinating funds. And the other one is MET funds contribute to rent costs of a local nonprofit's after school program to expand space for serving additional migratory children. So you're working with other programs to expand the program to allow more migrant children to receive services. Next slide. Another great resource available to districts is our Title I-C spending handbook. And this goes deeper into everything we've talked about, so I won't talk more about that, but I encourage you to take some time and look that over. Next slide. Quick knowledge check. Is it allowable to use Title I-C funds to pay for families' migratory moves? Can you use your Title I-C funds to pay for the migratory move? True or false? I'm seeing a lot of falses, which makes me happy. Yes, we cannot use Title I-C funds to pay for migratory moves. We can use Title I-C funds to provide services to children that make migratory moves, but we can't be funding like the gas or the tents or the nets. That doesn't align with the purpose of the program. Next slide. I believe we're coming close on time, so I'll go quickly through these resources. Next slide. So the micro program has several training resources. We have a Title I-C YouTube playlist that has a ton of different instructional tutorial videos for you, as well as we keep our annual fall training materials posted year round. So if you want to have local trainings or you want to refresh yourself on any particular training that we did for recruitment, they're all available to you. Next slide. Other resources, our Title I-C webpage for DEED is so full of so many different resources. You can see our state needs assessment, our service delivery plan, the spending handbook I talked about can be found there, that guiding documents template, as well as other resources. And then the U.S. Department of Education also has a couple web pages that have some resources that would be of some interest. Next slide. On the screen, we have my great team. The Migrant Education Office is what we call ourselves. There's Adam, he is our data specialist, so you'll work with him for any reports for the program. Chris Mariano is our identification and recruitment specialist. So if you're, trying to write your IDNR plan, you reach out to her. Janessa Lawera, she is our eligibility specialist, and she almost single-handedly reviews every single migratory child's paperwork in the entire state each year, and that's around 13,000 children. So she is a busy lady reading those really fun paperwork, reading the really fun paperwork called the Certificate of Eligibility. Next slide. Are there any questions? I went through a lot really fast. Well, if you don't have any questions, you know how to reach me. If you go to the next slide for my contact information. It's been a pleasure. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns.
Thanks, Sarah. Cecilia, before I turn it over to you, I think I'm going to stop sharing and Chris is going to share her slides. Perfect. Okay, I think we're good.
Okay, that was fast. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Title I-D, and there are two parts to it, subpart 1 and subpart 2, and I'm going to walk through both of them with you. Now, these are programs that not lots of districts are involved in, so you'll want to notice when we come up to the list of eligibility, whether your district is on there. Next slide, please. So subpart 1, the purpose of it is to improve educational services for children and youth to be able to meet the same challenging academic standards as other students in the state, to provide such children and youth with the services needed to make a successful transition from the institution to further schooling or employment, and to prevent at-risk youth from dropping out of school, and to provide dropouts and children and youth returning from correctional facilities or institutions with a support system to ensure their continued education and involvement of their families and communities. Next slide, please. So the subpart 1 eligibility, as I said, is limited to institutions for neglected or delinquent children and youth, attending community day programs for neglected or delinquent children and youth, or in adult correctional institutions. And you can see we have funding for 6 facilities in our state. So this is my funding that comes straight through GMS as part of the consolidated application. Next slide, please. So some of the required activities for these funds are assistance in the transition of students between correctional facilities and locally operated programs. They're supposed to assess the effectiveness of academic, career, and technical skills, ensure students will have the same opportunities to achieve as other students in the state. And there's a priority for a student to gain a high school diploma. We also want to make sure there's timely re-enrollment or re-entry that meets the needs of the students, including the transfer of credits, and participating in credit-bearing coursework while in secondary schools, post-secondary education, or career and technical education program. A lot of emphasis on these students trying to earn credit. Many are credit deficient when they come into the institution, so they're trying to do the best they can to help those students catch up and graduate. Next slide, please. So one of the big things that we look for in the application and we need to make sure we're providing is these transition services. We need to spend 15 to 30% on these services. And those are transitions between schools and facilities, pre-placement programs, work site, transition from post-secondary and employment. And then we can also include some support services, counseling, personal, academic, CTE counseling, placement and college financial aid, and job placement. What you'll see is in the application, there's a tag that you need to add to these expenses so we can identify them as transitional services. Next slide, please. So the use of the funds in subpart 1 is pretty basic. It's to concentrate on providing participants with the knowledge and skills needed to make a successful transition to secondary school completion, career and technical education, or further education or employment. Next slide, please. Some of the other uses of funds include programs and projects may include acquisition of equipment, pay for success initiatives, and targeted services for youth who have come into contact with child welfare or the juvenile justice system. There's also educational services, the opportunity to meet challenging state academic standards and respond to the educational needs of students, including by supplementing and improving the quality of education. Next slide. One of the things that is a little bit unique to this program is a program under this subpart that supplements the number of hours of instruction students receive from state and local sources should be considered to comply with supplement, not supplant, part of that section. With regards to the subject areas in which the instruction is given during those times. So a little bit of leeway on the supplement supplant for these programs. Next slide. This slide shows the funding amount that we get for the 2 different parts. I think these are preliminary amounts, so they may be slightly changed. I know that there's a slight bit more money in subpart 1 and subpart 2 for this next upcoming year. Next slide. So there are 3 purposes of the subpart 2 program. So this is the other part where different people are eligible to provide high quality education programs to prepare students for secondary school completion, training, employment, or further education. To provide activities to facilitate the transition of such children and youth from the correctional program to further education or employment. And to operate programs in local schools for children and youth returning from correctional facilities and programs which serve at-risk children and youth. Next slide, please. So this eligibility is a little bit different. It's really LEAs with high numbers or percentages of youth residing in locally operated correctional facilities for youth. That includes facilities involving any day programs, or participating in locally operated programs or schools that serve children and youth who are at risk or delinquent. So we get a little bit more of an expanded list. There's about 10 districts that are eligible for this funding. Right now, we are currently funding the top 5. We have an RFA out right now that's due April 28th. And hopefully we'll have more people apply and we can fund more districts to help provide these services. Next slide, please. So in subpart 2, one of the required activities are somewhat similar in that they have educational programming, they have transitional and support services, they can have formal agreements with LEAs and correctional facilities or alternate school programs. They can ensure students are participating in a comparable education program, or they can have transitions between the LEA and the facility. The use of funds for these programs kind of follow along the same line. One is it can assist in transition. It can do dropout prevention programs. It can do programs for children and youth in correctional facilities. And it can do coordination of health and social services, especially when it's going to likely improve the completion of their education. You can see there's lots of services there that they can use these funds for, and programs that provide mentoring and peer mediation. Next slide, please. I've provided a couple definitions for you because they may not be as familiar. One is the definition of an adult correctional institution is a facility in which people, including persons under 21 years of age, are confined as a result of a conviction for a criminal offense. So the second one that I'm giving you is at risk. The term at risk is used when it's respect to a child, youth, or student, means a school-age individual who is at risk of academic failure, dependency adjudication, or delinquency adjudication, has a drug or alcohol problem, is pregnant or is a parent, has come into contact with the juvenile justice system in the past, is at least 1 year behind in the expected grade level for the age of the individual, is an English learner, is a gang member, or has dropped out of school in the past, or has a high absenteeism rate at school. So there's lots of criteria that can help determine an at-risk youth. We have a few at-risk youth programs in our state. Next slide, please. A community day program means a regular program of instruction provided by a state agency at a community day school operated specifically for neglected or delinquent children and youth. And the last one is the Institution for Neglected or Delinquent Children and Youth is a public or a private residential facility other than a foster home that is operated for the care of children who have been committed to the institution or voluntarily placed in the institution under applicable state law due to abandonment, neglect, or death of their parents or guardians, or a public or private residential facility for the care of children who have been adjudicated to be delinquent or in need of supervision. So hopefully those will help define some of the information that we've gone over. This is my contact information. If you have questions further about whether you qualify or whether you need help in doing your application, I'll be happy to help you and answer questions as I can. It's a new program to me, so we'll probably be learning a little bit of it together. And Courtney, I finished a few minutes early.
That is totally fine. Thanks, Cecilia. I believe, so next on the agenda, and we've got a couple minutes, so maybe this will be the perfect opportunity to take a quick pause. If you want to grab your lunch for the lunch and learn, we've got about 30 minutes that our school improvement team will be talking about school improvement. So why don't you stretch your legs, maybe grab your lunch if you're hungry. And then right at noon, we'll toss it over to Brittany and Sue, who will be talking about school improvement. So let's take a quick break, quick 4-minute break, and then we'll come right back. Sounds
Well,
good.
good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for lunch. I know you've had a very busy morning going over the consolidated application and all the different components of that. We're very happy to be here, however, to present some information about school improvement. And the information is going to be presented as a series of questions that we will be answering through the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, if you have additional questions, we will refer you to some resources we have developed, and then stay and use as much time as we have available to answer any questions you might have. My name is Susan Forbes. I am new to the Department of Education and Early Development, and I'm working in school improvement as a specialist and program manager. With me today is Brittany Bailey, who is the School Recognition and Support Administrator. And without any further ado, we're going to move into some questions. So the first one is rather broad. It's what is school improvement? And I'm going to define it as a process of identifying and supporting underperforming schools. Note that this process may include additional oversight and monitoring in the cases of persistent underperformance. So how do we identify underperforming schools? Underperforming schools are identified via the state accountability system. Many of you are familiar with the visuals shown here on the screen. Please do recognize that these are based on our ESSA plan. And this is a year of transition to a new assessment. So the largest portion of our index score shown in green on both visuals is growth. And this will not be a measure that we can utilize this year based upon the fact that we're moving to a new assessment. However, the components that you see in the other parts of the pie on either case are going to still be metrics that are used. We'll start first with this idea of achievement, which is based upon student proficiency on the ELA and math assessment. Note that for grades K to 6 schools, this comprises 30% of the total, and then for high schools, 20%. Both pies, both visuals have that chronic absenteeism as representing 10% of the metric that's used to identify underperforming schools. EL progress is 15% for grades K to 6, and then for grades 7 to 12, that would be 10%. Also note there's a difference between the elementary grades and the upper grades in that grade 3 ELA, the proficiency of students for grade 3 ELA comprises 5%, whereas at the high school, that's not represented. However, we have graduation rate, which comprises 20%. Interesting. I have a difficult time advancing the slides today. So based upon these visuals and this accountability system, there will be 4 performance categories identified for schools. The first is our lowest 5% performing schools. This is called comprehensive support and improve it, lowest 5%. Then you have your comprehensive school and improvement graduation rate schools. These are the schools that do not have 2/3 of their 4-year cohort of students graduate within 4 years. Targeted support and improvement schools are those schools or the subgroups such as a demographic group or students with disabilities. They have a subgroup that's not performing at that cutoff point for the lowest 5% schools. And then our 4th category shown is universal support. These would be all of the schools that are not in those 3 categories above. They are not designated for additional support. So the purpose of school improvement, really it's this idea of providing equitable access to high quality education for all students. The idea here is if we provide additional funding support for underperforming schools, then perhaps that we can raise the measure of those schools and make sure that all students have access. The funding source is Title I, with 7% of Title I funds going to school improvement. And these are provided directly to underperforming schools who complete the grant application and receive deed approval of their plan. So who supports underperforming schools? DEED's School Recognition and Support Team. You'll see listed the program administrator at the bottom of the list. She should really be at the top of the list. This would be Brittany. She's overseeing what all of the different people within our group are doing. You have me as a school improvement specialist and program grant manager there, like looking at your grants as they come in, contacting you, providing you assistance in completing those grants. We currently still have a state system of support coaches in place, and these are also being helped this year with empowerment specialists. Moving forward, we will be having empowerment specialists there to support our underperforming schools. In addition, we have content specialists. Joy Abbott is working on the mathematics at the state level currently, and an ELA specialist is being hired. In addition, we have Holland's Emily, and she is working as a person directly involved with our reading grants. District levels, different options there. It really depends upon the size of the district. Larger districts are going to have a federal programs administrator, school improvement specialists assigned, perhaps support staff, literacy coaches, data managers. So basically, how are underperforming schools supported? This idea of Title I funds to support school improvement are based upon the idea of planning by looking at your data and needs will help you implement school improvement changes. That planning is going to involve setting some goals and then checking in on those goals over time as you initiate evidence-based practices to support learner outcomes. DEED also offers technical assistance, and the first there that you see, alignment of goals and actions to needs. This is what I would be doing as program manager when I review the applications I receive. Then you have professional development, for example, the Science of Reading Symposium that's coming up, and the PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention and Support Program right now that people are attending in Oregon. These are examples of professional development identified by the state as potential sources for improving underperforming schools. In addition, DEED offers technical assistance as far as providing you some information on processes and procedures to support your implementation, your measurement, and your monitoring of your school improvement plan. And as I mentioned earlier, we have our state system of support coaches, and moving forward, our empowerment specialists, where additional on-site specialist support is provided via contract. So this idea, what is the process for school improvement? DEED is piloting a new process for school improvement this year that's developed specifically to address poor student performance. Our Commissioner, Michael Johnson, has initiated the Project for Successful School Improvement to promote rapid improvement at our underperforming schools. We have 5 schools in cohort 1, and they are going through a pilot of this school improvement process this current school year. Empowerment specialists are there on site and via internet because we still have some issues with visiting sites in this current situation with COVID, but they're trying to develop a 3-year plan. And based upon feedback from this group, that plan and that program will be rolled out next year. Because the process is still under development, as much as I can share about that process is shown in the visual below. You can see there's 4 steps. Step 1 is conducting a situational analysis. This is a much more in-depth process than our current needs assessment. Step 2 is creating an actionable plan. Step 3 is implementing, monitoring, and adjusting that plan. And then finally, step 4, reflecting, celebrating, and sharing both what has worked and what maybe are some issues that need to be resolved in conversations across the state. For those of you that are not aware of the schools that are in cohort 1, we had multiple sites apply for this pilot, and we had 5 schools whose applications were reviewed and accepted based upon the demographics of the site, the geographic situation, and the unique situation and circumstances of the school. Our participating schools are found in Tetlin, Wales, Selawik, Calskag, and Nightmute. So you might have a question now. Well, we have more than just 5 designated schools in the state. Yes, that's true. We have more than 120 designated schools. So what are non-cohort 1 schools doing? For this fiscal year, that's at the end of this current year, you're planning for fiscal year 23. We're asking non-cohort 1 schools to use their process that they have in place currently to submit their school improvement plan and just simply update that existing plan based on current data from this school year. Next year, however, these schools will begin developing a 3-year plan based on the new process that's being piloted. Non-cohort 1 schools will start this new process by tackling a mandatory goal that is part of their condensed application. The mandatory goal, which is the first step of the new process, is to have an increase in your diverse stakeholder representation on the school and community leadership team. The school and community leadership team is really the team that develops the school improvement plan. It is not the same as just a simple community review of that plan after it's created. The community members on this team are integral members of the development of the school improvement plan that will be a 3-year plan. Diverse stakeholder representation should include tribal and corporate leaders as members of the school and community leadership team. Other key differences in the new process. I mentioned earlier that there's a situational analysis. This is now being developed as a replacement for our former needs assessment. The situational analysis involves looking at a greater number of data sources to inform the plan development. In addition, both qualitative and quantitative data sources are being considered, especially when we're trying to gather information on community attitudes and beliefs about the role of school in developing their youth. The situational analysis and the subsequent process steps to develop that 3-year plan are going to require a series of school and community leadership team meetings. It's not going to be a one and done meeting. It's going to require 6 2-hour meetings at minimum. Additional meetings may be required based upon the site readiness. I'm bringing this up here so that schools who are listening now and members of your leadership teams can plan for next school year by thinking ahead and realizing that this new school improvement planning process is going to require scheduling some meetings so that your school and community leadership team can meet. Other key differences in the new process. There's 2 types of impacts that we will be monitoring via the plan and via our action planning based upon that plan. The first is direct impacts. This is how have your adult educator behaviors changed. Indirect impacts may be more familiar to you. You may be looking at initiating an action at a school site And then at the end of the year, checking on what impact that has had on student achievement. Other indicators you might be looking for there are things that come out in a school climate survey based upon student responses. There you can get some information about student attitudes. Student behavior possibly could come from discipline referral rates, tardiness, and then impacts on learning would hopefully show up in your achievement. So I have an example for PBIS of some direct impacts that you could monitor. The first two that are shown that are not bolded are what we typically would think of doing, making sure that 100% of our staff was trained, making sure that we have a school-wide behavior purpose statement. Bolded at the bottom, what I have listed there is something that might be a little bit more difficult to measure, but might be something very important to consider. And this would be really looking at your fidelity of implementation. You have a school-wide behavior purpose statement. Is 100% of the staff actually holding that same behavior expectation? Are rules uniform from classroom to classroom across the school? And are they enforced by all in the same fashion? Same thing, PBIS example for indirect impacts. You have listed there the typical things you might want to look at to measure whether or not your PBIS is having an impact on student behaviors, attitudes, and learning. But then you can also see student engagement in class might be something you want to try to measure, much more challenging perhaps. In addition, student out of classroom behaviors, what are the behaviors that are being seen by staff members when they do monitor in areas of the school outside of the classroom, areas such as hallways, outdoor recess areas, cafeteria. So the key differences that I've mentioned up to this point regarding direct and indirect impact monitoring might require a shift in your resources and or the development of systems and processes at the school and district to support the monitoring of those direct and indirect impacts. First listed is data storage, retrieval, and review. Is there a place, a common repository that's being utilized by the school to store data as far as school improvement plan implementation? Is that data able to be easily retrieved? And is there a process for reviewing that established at the school site? Second, are there data team discussions and calendaring and scheduling around data sources being placed into the school's schedule? Is there a time when data teams can meet and look at these pieces of information that are listed below? First listed is what would typically be looked at is your assessment data. Other data sources that I am providing here as examples are less common, but very powerful. First is walkthrough data. The second that I have listed is teacher observation, coaching, and mentoring, notes and sharing and reflection. Another might be lesson development at the site, delivery of that lesson and review and refinement via mentoring, observation, even video review. The last listed is student work exemplars and rubrics. This is really looking at conversations, grade level team conversations over student work. So in the best and most ideal world, this plan development takes place over the course of 6 2-hour meetings. Within that development, there is a community review that goes on early on after the school and community leadership team has looked through the data and brings key findings to the community. Once that plan is developed, it is also shared again with the community, with the empowerment specialist serving there as perhaps a modeler of how this might be done, but in some cases, there as an observer to support the school that has already internalized much of the new process. After this review by the community, it would then go to the district level for review. And ideally, the plan would be presented to the school board for their approval prior to deed receiving it for our review. Once it goes through deed approval, then again, it would come back to the school as an approved plan, and the community could access that school improvement plan through a public posting. This is the ideal process for the review of these 3-year plans that we would like to see. This is one reason why we have moved forward the date for the condensed application to May 1st, is we want to start having this review and this back and forth between the school, the community, the district, and the school board precede deeds receipt of the plan. So I've gone on at length, and I know that you're eating lunch, and I really appreciate you being here, but there may be some questions at the end of our session that don't come up and that we don't discuss. There are some resources listed here that you can go ahead and access afterwards. One is our school improvement FAQs with information on our designations, improvement planning, and our grants. In addition, I have here a link to our condensed application. And then we do have a condensed application exemplar, which really highlights many of the ideas I've shared today. The intent here is not only to make sure that our designated schools understand the requirements for completing the condensed application, but it's to provide a model of how to connect specific data and needs to school plans for improvement, including goals, interventions, and activities. And then the last resource I have listed is our directions to the condensed application. But if you go to the webpage that's here at alaska.gov, you're going to go to the school recognition and support team page, and you can also find a series of webinars. We've done 6 webinars so far, providing information on the transition to the new process, the components of the condensed application, and then most recently, the exemplar. So I've come to the end of our presentation. I haven't heard much from anyone, and I would love to have questions or comments from people who are eating the lunches and listening along.
There was a question in the chat from Megan Hayes from Nome asking about, can we use school improvement funds for food for this process, specifically talking about those long meetings? I did answer in the chat that yes, a modest amount can be used, like please no lobster. But yes, like food, excuse me, funding can be used for food in support of getting parents and community members involved in the process.
Anybody else have any more questions?
So this is Megan again,
Hi,
and
Megan.
I know that we might have a school in this process next year. And my question is, so even schools who aren't part of cohort 1, we are still going to start following the process now of having the meetings and everything in the 2022-2023 school year?
Yes, we were going to be rolling it out in the 2022-2023 school year. The time frame for that rollout would be a little bit later on in the year, but we want to front load that mandatory goal because that seems to be quite a challenge at a lot of our sites. And so that's what you would be working on. As far as the calendaring of those 6 2-hour meetings, my suggestion would be to schedule those in the winter and spring. I would give us the fall to try to get that diverse stakeholder representation. We will be providing you information about the new process, but really I think that you're going to need some time to develop that school and community leadership team.
Oh, that's what I'm thinking. I've had a struggle. I think I was new in 2019 here, and I think with the pandemic setting in, it was just, there was kind of this lag time in getting going, and then we suddenly couldn't have in-person meetings. And I really struggle to get people to come to meetings. I mean, really struggle. And I'm hopeful. I'm working with a board member right now to try to improve our situation.
Thanks. I understand that. With our empowerment specialists at the 5 sites, we've noticed the same difficulty at 3 of those 5 sites. And it is an extreme challenge, and I think COVID only compounds it.
And that was why I asked about the food is, I figure there maybe, lunchtime meetings or something where there was, we could promote it as some kind of a working lunch kind of a thing. I don't know, but we'll talk about that. Thank you.
Oh, no, of course. And then in an exemplar I presented last night, I had, I believe, $800 set aside for those school and community leadership team meetings, specifically for the lunches is what it describes. Yeah, your team, your school and community leadership team does not need to be the entire community. You just need a representative member of that community there. And ideally, you need to have the team small enough so that you can actually action things. So team size, of course, depends upon school site size, but recommendation would be something between 6 and 10 members. Not all community. You're going to have teacher,
Okay.
paraprofessional, district staff, principal, parent, student, tribal rep, and 1 community member.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for thanks for that clarification, because I was thinking, big, kind of like the migrant education parent meetings or Indian Ed, Title VI meetings and that kind of thing. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. I'm just going to give you one more piece of information as well. You will have one larger community meeting in which you share your key findings from that very involved situational analysis. So that may require an additional amount of money. It could be something that dovetails with a Title I plan sharing. It could dovetail with another student exhibition of learning that's going on at the school. But that particular meeting would take probably anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half of that evening event.
Okay, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody else for letting me kind of hog the time here. Thank you very much,
No,
Susan.
that's fine. Thanks, Megan.
Well, and I believe we have a couple more questions, but I believe Woody got his question answered through Megan's questions and your answers, which are teachers required to be involved in the parent and community meetings?
Yes.
And then Laurel had asked, where do we find a current list of the schools? I only find 2019 on the DEED website, and I'd let her know that because of our waivers and the hold on assessments and the lack of or the low attendance or low participation in the latest assessment, that our designations have been on hold and since 2019 and will continue to be on hold into next year. So if you have a designated school this year, they will be designated next year as well. And we will try to get that document updated so it actually says the correct years so we're not confused anymore. And are there any other questions? We've got 1 minute. Woody, I saw you on mute.
Yeah, let me just go ahead, just for clarification. So to follow up with the teacher requirement for the community meetings. So those 6 2-hour-long meetings, those 6 2-hour-long meetings are specifically the team of what you said, like maybe 5 or 6 or 8 people, question mark?
Yes.
Okay, so then the teachers will be meeting separately doing school improvement planning based on the responses and the feedback from those community meetings.
The community meetings are school and community leadership team meetings. So the teacher representatives, it could be more than one, would be on that committee.
Okay, on the committee, but then we would do monthly PLCs or however often PLCs based
As-
on the feedback from those meetings.
You would have those PLC meetings based upon the plan that's developed, and then you would be reviewing progress towards goals. But that plan development, the community members are on that. You may have more teachers than a single teacher on the school and community leadership team. The groups that I've been seeing, I've actually seen them as large as, I think there's 9 on Northwest Arctics. And so they have 2 teachers, 1 para, 1 district, 1 principal. They have a community member. They have a tribal representative. So it depends on your capacity, but
Mhm.
they really are developing the plan.
Okay, and a follow-up question, if I can, please. The SIG grant would then cover some sort of stipend for the teachers that are working on the committee?
Yes, it could.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I have there our contact information. If
Sue,
you
I
think of
think
something,
Jenny-
contact us.
I think Jenny Randall might have a question. Jenny, do you
Yep.
have a question? Yeah.
Hi, Jenny.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I've been participating in so many of their meetings, I've been sort of just listening with half an ear. But thinking of these, the community group, the stakeholder meetings, we've been consolidating our CSI schools because they have a lot in common, it's all grad rate. Would we be able to have one, one identified group for our CSI schools instead of 3 different ones? Because that could be a capacity issue.
That's a new idea, and I haven't thought of it, and it might be a way to address it, but I'm not sure if it's supposed to be site specific for each school. And so we'd really have to run that by the developers of the plan, which is Achievement Development Incorporated, and see what their thoughts on that are. What do you think, Brittany?
All 3 of the schools have the same leader. They all fall under the same director. And so they're really individual sites all underneath one person.
Yeah, that seems to make sense. I don't have a response for you right now because I need to check and see what's going to be rolled out. What do you think, Brittany?
I apologize. I missed the question. I was answering a question in the chat at the time, and I'm terrible and I can't listen and type at the same time.
I'm thinking for the Fairbanks CSI schools. So it's the Fairbanks Best program.
Mhm.
It's our ALS programs, which is, a group of different disparate programs at different sites. And then our Golden Heart Academy, which is our DJJ facility. And a lot of these people, like our social worker, she works at all of those programs. She's assigned to all of them. The director, Lori Beam, she's in charge of all those programs. So the question is, can we consolidate the stakeholder meeting and the stakeholder input as a single entity and not have, would Best absolutely be required to have their own group? I mean, we don't even have that many people for a DJJ, it's going to be a stretch to get
Jenny,
participants.
that's a really good question. And much like Sue, I don't have a direct answer for you right now, but that is something that we will definitely take into consideration. I know there had been talk before of can we combine this meeting with another different meeting? And on that, we did say no, this has to be its own thing, but combining different groups for the same kind of meeting, using a lot of the same people, I think there could be an argument for that. And I will, like Sue said, we'll take it to the larger group of people that we were partnering with in this process and see what they think and argue the case, really, because I do understand that the low capacity and low time, and to have 3 people or a single person have to do the same meeting 3 times in that large of a quantity, that's a lot. So
Right.
Thank you so much for bringing that to our attention. We really appreciate that.
Thanks.
Thanks. We've got to check on the allowability of having one plan go and be held for 3 different sites.
All right, and then Amanda's following up with it's an issue in Juneau as well. So thank you, Amanda.
Got it. Okay. Any more questions? I know that you guys are eating lunch. Maybe you're feeling like you might have some food in your mouth, but you can type it in if you need, or you can use the email addresses here or phone numbers and reach out to us at a time that's more convenient, or if something comes up. By hearing from you, we get more information and we're able to develop a process that will work in all the different types of situations that exist out there. So Jenny, thank you for your comment and your question, because that gives us something to follow up on and consider. Brittany, you want to say anything in closing, or?
Just that, again, I really appreciate you guys coming to us with your questions or concerns. It's always nice to see familiar faces and names if I don't get to see your faces, and know that you guys you're the people in it. And so we're over here doing our best to try to bring it all together, but without you, nothing happens. So thank you so much for being a part of the ESEA meeting in general and joining us for this this lunch and learn. And yes, please reach out at any time. We're here to support you.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.